Today on the Writing Coach podcast, I have Deryn Tang. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
So could you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what you have going on in the world of writing, as well as in helping authors?
Right. Well, I started writing a little while back. I started doing church newsletters, but I'd always wanted to do writing and art. And so I took a Writers Bureau course and I started that way. And it's been a long, slow journey because obviously these things take time and you can't always just get to do what you want to do. You also have to earn a living at the same time. But when I retired, I decided I was going to really make it work for me this time. And I started off by doing just small things, trying to get a few articles written, travel articles, because I've done a bit of traveling, and reviews for TripAdvisor, just small starts. But as I progressed, I realized obviously we all need help along the way. It's not a one-man band. And so when I was invited to do a part of an anthology, I found that was a very good intro into getting into published. And then, of course, people need to have their work reviewed. And it's always difficult to find someone who's going to review your books or your work. And so, because when I was doing the Writers Bureau course, they said to me as well, doing reviews is also a very important part of being a writer. So that's why I started doing reviews and to do beta readings just to help others, and excuse me, with it in hope that it will be reciprocated too.
Well, I know you actually grew up in South Africa. Is that correct?
Well, sort of. I grew up in Rhodesia, which was Zimbabwe. Excuse me, let me just take a sip of water.
Absolutely. I'll do the same. Cheers.
Yeah. I grew up there, and I actually started writing there. I had my first letter published in the newspaper when I was about 10 years old. My grandfather was a great writer, and he used to write letters to the newspaper all the time. And he encouraged me a lot to do that. And so when there was something of interest, I wrote my letter and got 5 bob for it.
Oh, and which made you a professional.
Yes. So that's where it all started, really.
So it sounded like you had some real support at a young age in terms of embracing the arts and writing and communicating.
Well, I'll put it this way. My grandfather was a great support. He used to love poetry, and he'd teach me how to write poetry. He'd also be a self-learner. He grew up in the era of the Boer War, and he had a tutor. And they were always taught to teach themselves. And so that was his modus operandi. And as a child, I would be walking past him reading the newspaper, and he'd suddenly call out to me. And I'll never forget this one day, and he says to me, "What's a coup d'etat?" Well, about a 7 or 8-year-old child's not going to have the foggiest idea what a coup d'etat is. But he would make me then go and fetch the dictionary, look it up, find out what it meant, and learn about it. And then probably 2 days later, he'd call me back and say, "Hey, what's a coup d'etat?" And I'd have to tell him and be able to spell it. So in many ways, that was the encouragement that I got. I think also, I went to a school that we had very good literature teachers, and we had also from the Cambridge in the UK, the certificate we wrote. It was very well structured, and I think we really enjoyed our literature. And as well, because I went to a very brand new school when I was young, the headmaster was the main teacher, and he didn't have time to teach. And once we could read and write, he just said, well, go to the stockroom and get a book and read. And so we sort of basically self-educated ourselves with the books that were in the stockroom. And so I think that was where my love of reading really began. And then as you progress in life, things happen, and I started to write for the church newsletters, and eventually I became like the editor of a church magazine. And along the journey of my life and working in the UK, I also submitted to the local the company news magazine that they put out, and various other small articles here and there. But I think the main focus now was getting actually into being published properly and having books on Amazon that people can buy. And so I started that journey, I think it was 2 years ago, got one part put in an anthology. And then last year I had an opportunity with a fantastic group of South African ladies writing another anthology of devotions with an African theme, which I so enjoyed doing that. And all along the way I've also been helping others, doing reviews for them, looking out for them to try and promote their work as well.
Well, I currently live about 15 minutes away from where I grew up, a very sheltered, small life. So I'm always impressed by people like you who've lived all over the world. Can you tell me a bit about what that has been like, changing continents, and then how that perhaps inspired some of your travel writing?
Yes. Well, I think, transitioning is not easy. And I've had to move continents 4 times. And my family's moved all over the world. I've got family in Australia and the UK and America, plus other small places. But, it's been a hard road because I've had to leave my homeland because things didn't go well there. And so I had to transition into another country, which was South Africa. I had to make my way there and learn another language and function in that language, because the job that I had as an exploration cartographer required that I spoke another language. And so that job actually really inspired my course eventually. But after I had finished with that job, when my late husband died, I wanted to move to the UK to be near my one child. And so I had to move there, and I changed my whole career path. I had changed from a cartographer to a housing manager, but when I went to the UK, I had to change to being a old age home manager. And so, your life experience now enriches so much because you've had to learn, you've been challenged to the utmost, you've had to learn another language, you've had to learn a completely different set of laws as well, working in a different environment, from regular housing to elderly housing. And all those things, give you so much experience, and you realize you have to build resilience into your life to be able to cope with that. And my one son married a Finnish girl, and I had to go and visit Finland for a couple of months, to go and visit with his family and get to know them. There's another language altogether, and I don't claim to speak much more than about 3 words, but their culture is completely different as well. And all these things challenge you, from your regular, you do it this way, that's how it's done in our culture, and that in other cultures it's just not done that way. You really have to adapt and stretch yourself. And so I think that has given me a lot, and I've been inspired not just by the places, but also by experiences in those places. You know, for instance, in the middle of Finland, in the middle of night, I was traveling. I don't speak the language. I was on the coach and it broke down in the middle of the nowhere. And I didn't know how I could contact anyone to say, look, I don't know where I am and I don't know how to contact you. And, you know, you have to have a bit of faith then. And just know, look, God knows where you are. He knows where you are. And fortunately, my son had placed an app on my phone that he could actually get the GPS location where I was, and then he could track where I was and inform the family who were to pick me up. But, you know, there's things like that that actually also, I think it stretches every part of you when you travel. But then you also have the pleasure. It may be challenging, all these things, but you do have the pleasure of seeing all the wonderful places in the world. You know, I have been to under the ocean in Australia to see the barrier reef. I've been to the top of mountains. I've been in the deepest snow in Finland and in hot deserts in Namibia. You know, there's been just so many wonderful experiences and places that I've visited. And of course, having come from a land where there is a huge Rhodesian diaspora, I've got friends all over the world who've had to travel the same road as I've had. Also the challenges of adapting to new countries and new cultures. And it's actually been really hard for some of them because, you know, we were a community and that community was completely dispersed. We were displaced people. And so we've all made our own way in the world. And when we can meet up in places like Australia, it's been absolutely fantastic. And, you know, the years just roll away and you back to where you were 40 years ago.
In your art, not just in your writing, but also the fine art that you do, I know you have a great interest in nature, flowers, growth. Does that come from having seen a lot of the world, or what is the relationship between the natural world and your art?
Well, I suppose that also started in my childhood. I was passionate about nature, you know, and my grandfather also was another one who was teaching me about all the insects and birds and plants and everything. And during the school holidays, he would say to us, okay, now we're going to learn some botany. And he'd make us go out into the fields and collect plants, and then we'd have to come back to the house, identify them in his reference book and stick them in a book and label them. And I just think, you know, with that, living in a natural environment, because it was pretty natural, I really got that foundation. But I also really enjoyed like biology when I was at high school, because there you could draw all the things that you were learning about. So I could draw a bird and I could draw frogs and I could draw plants and seeds and all the other things that went with it. So, you know, that to me was really very, it just gave me that love of drawing what I was seeing. And so when I was going to get a job, it was a sort of a toss-up between going into a laboratory to see the kind of, and draw the diagrams of what I was experimenting with, or to go into the geological survey. And I got a job at the geological survey doing mapping. And I just loved that. It was such fun. Learning about the earth and the rocks and finding gold and all those sort of things in the mining, and drawing up those diagrams and colouring in the maps. So that also just, it was part of the natural world. So when I've been traveling, it's those things, the detail. When you look at the detail of all these tropical plants, you can see the most amazing patterns and colors. And then you go to a place like Finland, where it's so, you get the most minute little flowers, so absolutely perfect and small and beautiful colors as well. So, you know, the diversity of nature is astronomical. You know, you couldn't put a number on the different things, species and different types of plants and flowers and animals. And I just enjoy the beauty of it. I really do. So that inspires my art. But it's also the processes. So, you know, as a seed has to fall to die in the ground before it can live again. And, you know, to me, that's a lot of a metaphor for how we live. We often have to bury the old things and then wait for it to regenerate into something new. So that also inspires my writing, the way that nature works.
Yeah, I think you set up the segue for me. I was going to segue out of life and growth into death and separation, but I think you've already led us down that path, this idea that they're not opposites necessarily, but part of the same cycle. Can you speak more about that and how you've worked it into your work?
Yes, well, you know, when you're young, you have lots of dreams, you know, you think life's going to be absolutely perfect. And, you know, that I don't think anyone's ever woken up and said they've had an absolutely perfect life from the time they were born to the time they died. There's always been having to let go of something, or letting something die. Maybe it's an idea, maybe it was a marriage, maybe it was a family member who died. It could be anything that was very dear to you that you had to let go of in death, you know. But then that seed of that person's life or what they meant to you actually is in the ground, so to speak. You've let it sink deep into you. And then it's a process of going through the grieving process to let it go, to allow it to mature in the tears, you can say. You know, those tears water the new seed until it's ready to burst into bloom again and to bring life again to yourself and to other people. And, you know, that to me is, I think, one of the major parts of life. We have to be able to let go. We have to build resistance, because if you think of a tree, how every year it will bloom and bear fruit, and that fruit's either eaten or the seeds are planted again. And then the cycle is repeated on an annual basis. So we're going to have those, we've got to recognize there's going to be seasons in our lives that we've got to let go, we're going to have things die. We've got to work through those processes. There's a process that you have to work through before you can really, you've got to make it make sense to you in a way. You've got to be able to come to terms with what happened. And then you're ready to move on to grow into the next phase or stage of life.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to speak with you and have you on the show was I saw that you teach a course called The Hero's Journey Through Divorce, Grief, and Loss. And that sounded so fascinating to me. Could you tell us about this course?
Yes. You know, being part of being a cartographer, I was with a coach at one stage, you know, trying to figure out what I was going to do when I retired. And as we discussed my life, and she said, well, you know what, you know, you've got all these things, you just got to put them all together. So I came up with the idea of a map, because I'm a cartographer. And then it started to fall into place. I could make this map into my hero's journey. And so I have got this, it's free on my website, it can be downloaded. And you start off where you're in the Cape of Storms. So each of the places on this journey has got a name. And in my course, each of those are addressed in a chapter with questions, which are searching and getting you to reply to the answers in a way that makes sense to you so that you can move on to the next stage in your journey. And you'll see there's a lot of stations. There's a huge lot in a transition from being in a good relationship to being on your own, or to being in one country and having to go to another country. You've got to leave that old things behind. And that generates a lot of negative emotions and sad emotions. And, you've got all that anger. A lot of you get very angry at times because of this loss and why it happened. You've got to make sense of why it happened. And so my map does this journey. My course goes through this journey with you, enabling you to work out where you are on the journey. You may have to go back and forwards several times. I've got a labyrinth in there because we don't always get it right. You make your decision and you come to a dead end. You've got to go back and find another way through. And life's like that as well. Nothing's straightforward. It's got so many twists and turns. And one of the most important things I think on this journey is, having worked through all the negative parts of it, as you cross that river of forgiveness, where you forgive maybe yourself, you forgive the leaders of your country, or you forgive your ex, or you forgive whatever's made this situation so bad for you, and you start climbing this mountain, the Hope Mountain, to the lookout for the future. So from the top of the mountain, you can then see this place, the land of new dreams. But that's way away. It's not, you haven't reached it yet, but you've got to a place where you can actually see there is a future for you. So then you have to come down this mountain again, and then you have to work through a whole lot of other stations before you can actually get there. And part of my geological experience is you have to go through a mine. So you have to mine for gold, which is what was the good part of your experience. You find that and you work with that. And then you can either find you've just got to a place of peace and settle there, or if you're more adventurous, you can actually start getting new ideas and really go out again to make a even better life.
I think that's a process a lot of writers are familiar with, that idea of mining through the tough times to find the gold that you can then turn into a jewel or a work of art or a story.
Yes, that's right.
So the course is available, I believe, as an e-course on your website?
It is, yes.
So where can folks find that?
They can find it on my website, which is Crossing My Bridges, www.crossingmybridges.com. And if you look for the tab there that says the e-course, you will find it. But anyone who's just interested to look at the map, that's available to download for free.
Great. Well, we'll include links to that on the show notes for this episode, as long as I know you do lots of artwork on Instagram. You've got a Facebook group, so we'll include all those links on the show notes.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Kevin. That's very sweet of you.
Deryn, look into the future. I know you said you're focused on publishing right now. Tell us a little bit about, as we maybe see the end in sight someday for the pandemic, what you have on your horizon in terms of goals and writing.
Right. Well, I'm just busy now. I've had a back from my editor. I'm writing a book called Who Am I? What's God got to do with it, and does it matter? And it's basically a set of devotions or meditations on Psalm 139, because I found like Psalm 139 was my go-to when I was afraid or when I didn't know what was happening in my life. I could go to that, and that's where I held my faith in that God knew where I was. He knew what was happening. He was there when I was conceived, and he had planned every day of my life. And so even though I don't know what's happening, he does, because he's planned it. And so that's just my devotions in that book.
Is that what you just said now? Is that like a paraphrase of the psalm?
It's not so much a paraphrase, but I have actually written a devotion on each of the verses with a different focus. And I've also got a little booklet that can be downloaded with that, with a drawing for each of those verses as well. So I did a little drawing for each verse that a person can meditate with that as well, because sometimes we are more visual than verbal. You can understand things better with a picture than you can with your mind. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So, sorry, I think I interrupted. You said you just got it back from the editor?
I've just got it back from the editor, yes.
So what are the next steps then?
I think the next steps is I just need to try and find a publisher for it. Otherwise, I'm going to have to self-publish.
Well, you keep me posted on that process. I can't wait to see that book.
Oh, well, thank you very much indeed.
Deryn, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Kevin. It was really a lovely surprise, and I really appreciate your generosity in giving me this time to tell people a little bit about my writing process, and hopefully they will also be inspired.